Okay, thanks very much, Andres, and thank you everyone for coming to hear my brief webinar. Um, this is going to be somewhat different, probably to the previous ones that you had. I am an economist rather than a financial expert. So I come from this not in terms of a sort of technical what you should invest in, well, in terms of what particular uh, loans or whatever you should take out, but more coming from the perspective of looking at the future possibilities in the world and how you might respond to them in terms of investing, managing your finances over the longer term. So I'm thinking, 5, 10, 15 years, thinking about maybe your retirement, making sure that um, you're able to live reasonably into the longer term. And clearly, at the moment, we are in a place where there is a lot of uncertainty and a lot of unprecedented um, things going on in the political world, and also with climate change, as we'll see. And the sort of people who give you guidance and claim to be able to protect yourself against all the storms are people that I've come across called like Alhambra Investments. And they claim to be able to give you an investing strategy which will deal with anything. And they've done this by looking back over decades and seeing how different investment strategies between equities and debt and so on work in a wide range of scenarios. And they claim to be able to give you an investment strategy that will work in any of those scenarios. Now, but the key thing is that is based on the past. And over the period they're looking, there are some commonalities that may not occur in the future. So clearly, over all the period they looked, the US dollar was the dominant currency. And in the future, there is certainly scenarios where it may not be, with the rise of China in terms of its financial and economic power. Also, of course, during that period, there was no climate change. Again, something different about the future. And the classic story is of the cock that crows every morning when the sun rises and thinks, therefore, every morning as the sun rises, he will be able to crow until his neck gets cut. So the future never follows the past and sometimes diverges dramatically from it. So where do you look? And you could look in various places, but I thought as an illustration, the Ministry of Defence, you'd think the UK Ministry of Defence is not one to take wild and wacky thinking about the future, and it publishes every year global strategic trends, and does that through a range of workshops, consulting with experts, an extensive process to give some guidance to the government, but to others as well. And its main conclusion in its most recent report is, I think, quite striking. It says the rate of change and level of uncertainty may outpace good governance and unity. And what that means is that things are becoming so difficult and dynamic and uncertain that actually the ability of governments, both at a national and an international level, may not be there to actually deal and address the issues that arise. And out of that, we may see conflict rather than unity. And obviously, we see what's happened in the EU, we see Brexit, we see Trump, and so on. And we see an increasingly fragmented international government scene, as well as in a range of countries. Italy most recently, but obviously Greece some time back. But overall, the world's international political and economic scene seems more fragmented, more uncertain than it has been, certainly in my lifetime. So what does this report say when it looks in more detail? What it does is look at lots of different trends, 15 trends. And there's one, though, that really jumps out. A lot of these are international fragmentation, artificial intelligence, increasing competition, increasing popularization, and so on. But if you see up the left-hand axis is the level of impact, and along the right axis is level of uncertainty. So as you go right, uncertainty increases. So the highest impact trend with the least uncertainty is climate change, and which they describe as increasing disruption and cost of climate change. So I thought I'd take this particular, what might be called a known unknown, i.e. we know it's highly likely to happen, we know it's going to have a significant impact, but there's quite a lot of uncertainty about exactly how that will play out. So it raises questions as to what you might actually do about it when you're trying to protect your financial situation. And of course, this report, I think, obviously is inspired potentially by the latest International Panel on Climate Change report. And you can see that the trend in warming is heading above 2 degrees, certainly above 1.5, which is the point when things are getting dangerous. And once you go above 2, you're getting very dangerous. And it's not on the pathway towards a safe haven at all. And as one of the major people involved said, limiting warming to 1.5 degrees C, which is the level at which it may not be less dangerous, is possible, but would require unprecedented changes across the world, of course, that is. And that requires huge international collaboration, just as the US under Trump is moving away from international collaboration, and other countries are beginning to fracture in Europe, and so on. So what does the Ministry of Defense suggest? A lot of these things are fairly well known, but it gives us a hint from an authoritative source as to what we should think about when investing in different countries, in different companies. Obviously, classically, floods, droughts, storms, heat waves, and so on. But here, key thing is disruption affecting global markets and supply chains. So that is referring to the fact that at the moment we have a globalized economy and things come from all over the world. And at the moment, actually, with Brexit, suddenly the government's discovering that there are quite a lot of things that we take for granted that may well be disrupted during Brexit. This would only be magnified even greater with climate change. And we actually had a recent scare when carbon dioxide was suddenly no longer was in short supply and not available. And it turned out there was only one factory making carbon dioxide, and it's used extensively, obviously with soft drinks, but in other places. But there are a lot of other sort of hidden ingredients that we depend on, which could be significantly disrupted. Rising sea level hitting coastal cities, and of course coastal cities are the ports, again about supply chains, transport. Some ecosystems will rapidly collapse. Crops will fail more frequently, increasing migration, increasing tensions, disputes, and possibly conflict. One description of the effect of climate change is that it's like throwing petrol on the current fault lines, the current disputes, the current points of tension. So what do you do to this? These are the common responses. Either put your head in the sand or feel despair. In actual fact, an example of this, when the IPCC report came out, the UK government sent a letter to the Climate Change Commission to investigate whether we should be doing more on climate change, but not to look at doing anything before 2032. This was when the report said that we needed to do a lot more over the next 10 years to make a significant difference. So that seems to be a suggestion of putting your head in the sand and hoping it would go away. But the key thing as an investor, as someone who's trying to understand where to put your money, this gives you an advantage, because if you don't go into despair and don't put your head into the sand, then maybe you can do some things in terms of how you invest, how you manage your finances, which actually allows you to do much better. So there is, of course, the obvious things to do, and that is to divest from fossil fuels, from BP, Shell, and so on. Now, actually, that is quite a big deal, because a substantial percentage of shares are in these companies, and lots of pensions rely on shares in these companies. So you really need to look at what you've got your money in. If you've got them in tracker funds or in standard pensions, you're likely to be heavily invested in these companies, who almost certainly will lose significant value as a result of climate change. Previously, it was thought that they might be able to innovate and move into renewable energy, but that has not really worked for them, because actually their skill base is in digging up stuff in terms of getting oil out of the ground, and they're not actually in the energy business per se, and actually changing and adapting to providing renewable energy is something they did not find easy, and they basically, to a great extent, stopped. But there's some less obvious things, like Nestle, again, a very large company. They rely on two key ingredients, cocoa and coffee. Obviously, because they make a lot of chocolate and Nestle coffee and so on. Now, coffee and cocoa is very sensitive. The shrubs that they come from, and cocoa actually comes from trees, are very sensitive to climate change, and they will have to grow those higher up in the hills, and that could have immense consequences in terms of meaning that one set of people in these countries, a lot in Western Africa, but also in terms of coffee in South America, Eastern Africa, and so on. The communities that are currently growing them may not be able to grow them anymore, and they could lead to social and political conflict, because if suddenly Nestle starts sourcing their cocoa from the hills, that will be a different sort of people to the current set of people they currently source from. And Western Africa is going to be one of the places most hit by climate change. So it's likely to become much, much less stable. So the chances of them actually making an easy transition to growing their crops higher up may be quite low. Another one, which is less obvious, is that smartphones and a lot of other standard electrical gizmos that we rely on, including actually renewable energy and so on, batteries rely on a lot of rare metals, and actually a lot of them come from China. So you can imagine that if climate change creates disruption and conflict, and the relationship between China and the US and the West becomes much more tense, maybe the ability for us to get hold of a lot of these metals could be significantly reduced. So what do you do? And what might companies do to manage these risks? Because really what you need to do is look at the companies that you have shares in or investing in and seeing what they're doing to manage these risks. And the key choice is really between diversification, i.e. manage the risk by having as diverse a set of suppliers as possible, or concentrate with a particular to access stuff overseas in particular places where you think the risks are minimal, and furthermore actively try and reduce those risks. So if we take one example, Barfoots, they source vegetables from around the world for our supermarkets, and they have done two things. They both diversified in terms of finding more and more different places to grow their vegetables, but also interestingly they've also concentrated, particularly in Senegal. Now Senegal is in Western Africa, and they have now 2,000 employees, or I don't know if they're exactly employees, but people who work effectively for them, growing vegetables in upcountry Senegal by or near the river Senegal. And they identified this place as relatively resilient to climate change because of the large river running through, so they'd be able to access water, but also, and possibly more importantly, very stable in terms of Africa, at least, as the World Bank has said. Develop relationships, very close relationships with the people who work in Senegal. They have a workers sort of committee, and they are putting money into education there, into health, and so on. So they're creating a long-term relationship and concentrating a significant amount of production in a place where they think the risks are less. So what are other companies doing? What are the companies doing that you might be invested in? But maybe another strategy is that actually, given increasing risks to supply chains, to the international political system, that you actually think of investing close to home. And I'll give two examples here. One is Abundance. They are an investment provider, and you actually choose the company you invest in. And most of the investments actually are through short-term loans that you get a reasonable return from. So they provide loans to the startup for renewable energy projects, but also for social housing projects. And you can actually investigate the particular loan that you're making and look at the return and find out about the project and so on. And they are supplying a lot of the basics, because we know whatever else happens, we will still need food, we'll still need housing, we'll still need energy. And they will be coming, they come from around us. Obviously food comes from overseas, but maybe increasingly our food will come locally. And companies, organizations in this sort of space are likely to be more stable, they're less exposed to risk, international risk, and they have, or likely to have, much closer relationships with their customers. Another, even I think more interesting example is broadband for the rural north. Now this is quite quirky in that it's not your normal investment, but it is a project, a community project started in the rural north that provides hyper-fast broadband. So that's not 70 megabytes per second, which is a sort of BT super fast, It's actually 1,000 megabits per second upload and download for £30 a month in the countryside. And that is, most people in rural areas get about 5 megabytes. Even in the city areas, you might be lucky to get tens of megabytes. Unless you're a Virgin Media, you might get more, and it becomes more expensive. But what's interesting about this project, actually, it's as a not-for-profit project, and the people who invest in it, both through work, volunteering, farmers providing equipment, landowners letting people dig trenches to put cable across their land, are the local people. And the key thing it does is actually build communities, because the one thing that everyone has in common in rural areas is the desire for hyperfast broadband. And it radically changes the economy because people can suddenly work from home. It allows farmers to innovate and so on. And what I'm saying, and this is obviously, you might think an extreme sort of risk management, but if you go into move to a rural community and help make this happen, you will have joined the community, will help create a community. And ultimately, surviving, thriving is probably going to be down to a strong community that you're part of, which grows a lot more of its food locally, is much more self-sufficient. So it may not be about individuals, but strong communities. And by investing in B4RN, you actually get both fast broadband and a vibrant, supportive community. And in a lot of situations, particularly in debt and so forth, it's actually the community that, say, is borrowing from your family, your friends. In a similar sort of way, when it comes down to it, dealing with the increasing turbulence and challenges that we will probably have over the next decades, having a strong community is absolutely central. So don't put your head in the sand. Don't despair. Things will not change immediately. They will be bumpy. They will be challenging. But do take action, because this is probably, in terms of Ministry of Defence future trends, as close to certain as you can get. So do look to divest from carbon heavy investments, from oil industries. Do look at the climate change and socio-political exposure through international supply chains. Do look at investing in the basics. We will always need those basics. And if that can also be about investing in community, then do that too. And last but not least, I'm happy to answer any questions.